Let me say something more about John Kennedy. I wanted to show what Kennedy was like in specific dealings. When he was assassinated, I sincerely regretted it. I immediately went to the American Embassy and expressed my condolences. Kennedy and I were different kinds of people. I was a former mine worker, a machinist, an industrial worker who, by the will of the party, became prime minister, whereas he was a millionaire and the son of a millionaire. We represented classes that were in irreconcilable opposition to each other. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd love to earn your subscription. Well, today we are getting into something we've never done, and I hope you'll stay with it for me. It's something a bit unusual, I guess. It's not typical JFK assassination literature. However, today we're getting a look at the man John Kennedy, the President John Kennedy, the competitor John Kennedy, through the eyes of the Russian premier at that time, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. This is a book called Memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, Volume 3, Statesman from 1953 to 1964. It's edited by his son, Sergei, and it says it is the only complete and fully reliable English language version of the memoirs of this Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. I actually was super excited. I found this book for 25 cents on my library shelf. This volume, we only paid 25 cents for it. So super excited. They were getting rid of it and I was happy to take them up on it. I mean, look at the size of this thing, you guys. But I was so excited when I noticed that there was a whole chapter called John Kennedy and the Berlin Wall. And then the next chapter is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's about 60 pages here in this book that we're going to move through. And it is going to be, some of the pages we'll read significant portions of, but some of them I'm just going to pull out the highlights because that is what we're here for. We're here to basically get a look at what did Khrushchev think of John Kennedy? How did he perceive this man? Here is a photo of the two of them. We're going to read about this summit meeting in 1961. This is the photo of Khrushchev and Kennedy at that meeting in Vienna. So let's read about them. It starts with the 1960 election, which is a great place for us to pick up because we just read about that in our read through about Lyndon Johnson. We read about that election. So let's read about these events from the perspective of the USSR's leader, Nikita Khrushchev. The time came for the election of a new president in the United States in autumn 1960. The election campaign began. For the Soviet Union, all the candidates were the same. They all stood in favor of capitalism. It was clear that any of them would continue the same policies that Eisenhower had followed. As for John Kennedy, we didn't know much about him. It was said in the press incidentally that he had an excellent mind. During my visit to the United States, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had organized a reception in my honor. The chairman of that committee had been Fulbright. He introduced me to the others present, and when it came to Kennedy's turn, Fulbright mentioned his name. This is Senator John Kennedy. I shook his hand and said, "It's being said that a great future lies ahead of you." I always tried to say a few appropriate words to anyone I was introduced to. Our acquaintanceship went no further at that time. However, we knew that Kennedy differed from the other congressmen in his ability to react to events quickly and sharply, his high level of education, and his tactfulness. So that's his thoughts initially about Kennedy. After Kennedy became president, hopes for an improvement in our relations, so he's talking about the relations between the two countries, increased. Public opinion in the United States was being expressed more and more loudly in favor of improving our relations. Such voices were heard in Democratic Party circles and in business circles. Kennedy understood better than Eisenhower the necessity and rationality of taking such steps, not only for commercial reasons, but mainly because of the Cold War, which was still going on then, that it could develop into a hot war, and he didn't want that. We also were afraid of war. Only a fool would not be. I'm not afraid to say this. We were afraid of war because it would bring ruin and destruction to our country and to our people, causing very heavy casualties. Kennedy was a flexible man. The foreign policy of the United States was something that he personally decided. He brought a number of young, intelligent, and educated advisors into the White House. This is interesting because it mirrors what we read in Brothers by David Talbot, that the influx of young advisors was something not just being noticed by American generals and causing contention in those ranks, but also being noticed by Nikita Khrushchev. They were too flexible in questions of international policy, and the advice they gave him was along those lines. Since Kennedy himself was deciding the line of policy, the assistants he chose for all the posts were those who understood his goals and those whose abilities impressed him. So underlying this is the very criticism that the generals brought, which means not necessarily experience, but those who understood his goals and who had abilities that impressed him, not that they had a long history in judging foreign policy matters. Meanwhile, the American press was speaking in favor of a personal meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Finally, we received a proposal to meet on neutral territory. Kennedy proposed Vienna. I thought Helsinki would be better. But we were not afraid of Austria. In general, Vienna was a city that symbolized peace, and so we agreed to meet in Vienna. That's where that photograph was taken. I arrived in Vienna accompanied by Foreign Minister Gromyko, and President Kennedy was accompanied by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. I don't remember how many meetings there were, 2 or more. Our bilateral talks began. We exchanged opinions on the same questions on which we had been unable to arrive at agreement with Eisenhower, that is, Germany, West Berlin, disarmament, trade, and mutually advantageous economic ties. The fate of Germany remained the most sharply disputed question, although disarmament was of no less importance. Disarmament will always be the question of questions, but it was impossible to resolve that question without an agreement on Germany. And he points out, too, that then West Berlin becomes the issue because those things were tied together, that we're not going to disarm unless the question of Germany is answered, and the question of Germany rested on the issue of West Berlin. So it all comes down to West Berlin. Our exchange of views began. Kennedy took the same position that Eisenhower had. The policies pursued by the representative of the Republican Party, Eisenhower, and the policies of Kennedy representing the Democratic Party were one and the same. We placed our emphasis mainly on a solution to the German problem. What did Kennedy propose? Nothing new. The only difference was that he approached the matter more flexibly. One of the realities that Khrushchev says had to be accepted was the existence of 2 Germanys, the German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic of Germany. I looked because I wanted to know, this was published in 1999, so he's still, at least at this time when it was published, he's still basically arguing as if that was how it was going to be. Of course, by that time, the Berlin Wall had fallen, but Kennedy understood all of this, but inwardly he was not ready for such changes, nor was public opinion in the United States ready for them. And so he refused to agree with our arguments. Tensions continue over Berlin. He says, we stated our position that we regarded West Berlin as part of East German territory, and we considered the presence of Western troops there illegal. Kennedy argued the opposite. What did he say about peaceful coexistence? Y'all, this is a very interesting argument, and I hope you'll stay with me for it. I found it really fascinating to see what each of them are arguing and the way that the things that they are arguing seem opposed to what you would expect. So listen to the arguments here. He says, what did he say about peaceful coexistence? According to his understanding, we should come to an agreement and make this official in writing in the form of a treaty stating that both sides stood on the basis of peaceful coexistence. But he interpreted this, so this is saying Kennedy interpreted this as freezing the existing socio-political system in every country and not allowing any changes. This position was absolutely unacceptable to us, and I told him so. The question of the political system in each country should be decided by the people in that country themselves, even if the social system was changed by the decision of the people. That there should be no outside interference. This was our understanding of the matter. So he's saying, let the people decide. I made a brief excursion into the history of the United States. I said, at one time, the United States was a colony of Britain, but the people rose up and fought a war in which they were victorious. Thus, the United States became an independent country. History confirms that the internal questions exist that the people themselves must resolve, and non-interference in such internal developments must be guaranteed. The people of Russia had also made a revolution, and that too was an internal matter. So he's saying in Russia, in America, in lots of countries, we let the people inside the country decide, even if it means that they take on a totally and radically new form of government. Yet you want us, so he's talking to Kennedy, yet you want us to return to the times when agreements were made among monarchs to ensure the stability of their thrones and to combine their efforts for the sake of suppressing the people in rebellion. If the people of any particular country dare to display a desire for change in the internal situation of that country, we will never agree to such a policy and will fight against it by every available means. And then he says this, Kennedy was an intelligent man, but he was defending the interests of his class. I was somewhat surprised, and during our talks I expressed myself in a rather ironical manner, making fun of the position he was taking as old-fashioned and outdated. So I just thought that was really interesting. He does say this, during the conversations between Kennedy and me, only the interpreters were in the room with us, along with Rusk and Gromyko. Our conversation took the form of debates. I don't remember that Kennedy turned to Rusk with any questions or that Rusk made any comments. There was none of that. That's why I had the impression that Kennedy himself knew his way around quite well on international questions and was well prepared for the talks. Before our meeting, he had obviously studied all the questions we were likely to exchange views on, and he had absolutely full command of the material. This was not by any means what I had observed in the case of Eisenhower. This spoke in Kennedy's favor, of course, and in my eyes he grew in stature. Here was a counterpart to whom I could relate with enormous respect, even though we held completely different positions, and in fact were adversaries. I valued his qualities. If the president himself knew his way around on the details of foreign policy, this meant that he was the one deciding policy. So they get to the end of these talks. Neither one can really agree to what the other one is saying. And it's a very difficult end to the conversation. They each express their views and they are not able to come to any agreements on any points that they came to discuss. Our last meeting with Kennedy took place at a reception or a theater. Kennedy was very gloomy. He was not just preoccupied, but actually glum. When I looked at the expression on his face, I sympathized with him and I felt sorry for him. I wanted us to part on a more cheerful note, but there was nothing I could do to help him. Politics is implacable, and our differing class positions did not allow us to come to an agreement, regardless of any effort on my part. As a politician, I understood this, but as a human being, I sympathized with Kennedy. I also sympathized with him because, once again, we were being thrown back, possibly to a state of even greater tension, and to a continuation of the Cold War. We were going to have to pay for that because the arms race would start up again. More resources would have to be allocated to arms. First, that would happen in the United States. That would force us to follow suit. So he knows what's coming. He says, we couldn't come to an agreement. We're each going to have to go back to our countries. Each one of us is going to have to build up the armory. And that's going to take resources from other things we could be doing in our country. And instead, we're going to have to devote it to the tools of war. Then we get to the chapter called the Cuban Missile Crisis. I would like to explain what he calls it the Caribbean Crisis, was. When Fidel Castro achieved victory and marched into Havana with his troops in 1959, we in the USSR, to put it plainly, still didn't know what political direction the victors would take. On the basis of information received through various channels, we knew that Raul Castro was a communist, but we thought that he was keeping his views hidden from his brother, that supposedly Fidel didn't know anything about it. We heard that Guevara was also a communist, as were several other comrades in arms of Fidel, but that was all rumor, and no official relations between us had yet been established. Diplomatic relations were soon established with Cuba, and the USSR sent a delegation there. The Cubans were forced to turn to us for help because the Americans had stopped supplying them with petroleum, their chief source of energy. Life on the island virtually came to a standstill, and we had to quickly organize petroleum deliveries to Cuba. Americans assumed that the capitalist foundations in Cuba were indestructible, but when Castro proclaimed that Cuba would take the road of building socialism, it was already too late. Only one solution remained for them at that point: invasion from the outside. The Cubans were asking us for arms. As a result, Cuba was fairly well armed. The chief shortcoming of the Cuban army was a lack of necessary combat experience. They didn't know how to use the tanks at all. So they had sent tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter planes. The experience of guerrilla warfare had familiarized them with only small arms: rifles, submachine guns, grenades, and pistols. It was only from reports by the foreign radio stations that we learned that an invasion of Cuba had begun. We didn't know who was invading or with what forces. We didn't know if these were counter-revolutionary Cuban conspirators or the Americans themselves. We were sure that the invasion was being done with American participation at any event. Fidel swiftly mobilized his forces and dealt with the situation rather easily. The Americans placed too much confidence in the Cuban counter-revolutionaries, assuming that with the help of American arms they would be able to put an end to Castro. But they miscalculated. After Fidel's victory, we increased our aid to Cuba. We gave the Cubans all the arms they could absorb. The question was not then so much the quantity and quality of arms as the need for trained personnel capable of handling the latest, most advanced weapons. We welcomed their victory, but we were sure that this was only the beginning, that the Americans would not be content with this situation. When the Cuban counter-revolutionaries organized their attack on Cuba and landed at the Bay of Pigs, it was clear to any thinking person that it had been done with the U.S. blessing. Things could not have been otherwise. The landing was only possible because of support provided with U.S. military resources. We expected that direct support from the U.S. Armed Forces would occur then, but it didn't happen. That's what we read about in Brothers by David Talbot, that the CIA assumed, well, when we get into the thick of it, Kennedy will go ahead and send in reinforcements. Even though he has said he wouldn't, he will. And he didn't. We knew that the Americans would not reconcile themselves and invariably would find the opportunity and justification for a new aggression. In their view, might makes right. They would make their move, and then the people could figure out who was right and who was to blame. When Cuba no longer existed, Fidel no longer existed, and some new Batista was sitting in Havana and speaking to the whole world in the name of the Cuban people. It would be clear to anyone with the slightest experience that all of this was lies and slander, but the deed would have been done, and there would have been no one to act as a judge. It's an interesting perspective. He's actually giving the communication that Kennedy would talk about, that it was actually not a Pax Americana that we were going for in the world. So ironically, Kennedy's own foreign policy ideas dovetailed with what Khrushchev is saying, which is it's not actually right for the Americans or anybody to go into another country, take out a leader, set up a new leader, and let him speak in the name of that people. That actually, when that's done, the country no longer exists, the leader no longer exists, and some other person is speaking on behalf of the people when the will of the people had already been overrun. One could argue that that's what happened on November 22nd, 1963. But regardless, this is the issue that when you look at the way the world has shifted, Kennedy in the 1960s was saying, let's not enforce a Pax Americana. Let's not enforce peace in the world, but only by Americans sitting there, putting it all together, making it happen, installing our leaders, and then putting ourselves as governors over or observers so that everything we want is kept in place. That was something that, Bush made the case for in the 2000s, that we should basically spread democracy by assisting countries in that way. This is a much more actually like, let each country decide who they want to be. I'm not telling you what to think about this. I'm not trying to put forward my own ideas about foreign policy. I'm just saying that actually what he's arguing about is a very interesting perspective. He's saying when the people have already made a decision and the actions in a country are working themselves out, is it right for somebody from the outside to come in, move what the people have done out of the way and install their own leader and then say that person speaks for the country? It's a very interesting question. He says, when questions are decided by force of arms, morality is thrown aside. So his thoughts start going towards this. Something has to be done to protect Cuba. But what? Could some armed forces be used on our side? He says he's traveling in Bulgaria, but in his mind, he's constantly preoccupied. What's going to happen to Cuba? We will lose Cuba. We had to think of something. It was a highly complicated matter, trying to find something he could use as an effective counter to the United States. Naturally, the following solution suggested itself. The U.S. had surrounded the Soviet Union with its military bases and placed its missiles all around our country. We knew that the U.S. had missile bases in Turkey and Italy, not to mention West Germany. We granted the possibility that they also existed in other countries. They had surrounded us with military bases. The planes at those bases were within effective range of our vital industrial and governmental centers. And those planes were armed with atomic bombs. Couldn't we counter with the very same thing? I thought to myself, what if we were to come to an agreement with the government of Cuba and install missiles with atomic warheads there, but to do it in a concealed way so that it would be kept a secret from the United States? When everything had been talked through with Fidel, he says, I came to the conclusion that if we did everything secretly and the Americans found out about it only after the missiles were in place and ready to be launched, they would have to stop and think before making the risky decision to wipe out our missiles by military force. Our missiles might be destroyed by them, but not all of them. It would be enough if 1/4 or even 1/10 of the missiles we installed were still in place and could be used to hit New York with 1 or 2 nuclear warheads. He says this, which is crazy. Listen to these stats. The atom bomb that the United States dropped on Hiroshima had an explosive force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. But our warhead had an explosive force equivalent to 1 million tons. We knew that the destruction would be colossal. It seemed to me that might restrain the United States from military action against Cuba. To some degree, a balance of fear, a formula used in the West, might be reached. They had surrounded us with military bases and kept our country under the constant threat of possible nuclear attack, but now the Americans themselves would experience what such a situation feels like. As for us, we had already grown used to it. He walks around thinking about this. The plan takes shape. He says that was how the problem looked to me in the past, and it still does today. Our position necessarily has to be that we do not want war, and that we do everything not to allow a war to happen. But we cannot be afraid of war. If an unfavorable situation develops, you have to retreat. But if your retreat is the beginning of the end of your capacity for resistance, then it's better to risk everything. Try your best to crush your enemy. And if war is imposed on you, do everything you can to survive in that war and achieve victory. That is exactly how all of us understood the situation. Even today, I think about that a lot. And the path I traveled was a good one. Not only am I not ashamed of it, I am proud of it. It's hard to cut things out because this whole account is very fascinating of how they went about moving the wheels into place to put this war machine in place in Cuba. But he says, we were concerned most of all that our operation not be discovered ahead of time by aerial reconnaissance. The Americans were constantly flying over Cuba. Cuba is long and narrow, and therefore you can fly that way and photograph it. We wondered to what extent secrecy could be maintained. So they sent out these spies and are told that this is a good team. They arrived back and reported to us, in their opinion, that the deployment of the missiles could be kept secret. The not very high quality of these scouts was later revealed. They naively thought that palm trees would be enough to camouflage missile installations. The thing was that we were going to install the missiles on the surface to make silos for them and thus mask them more effectively. We couldn't think of such a thing. That would have required a great deal of time, and we had no time. So they go ahead and go in and set them up. The cargoes are conveyed to Cuba. The ships traveled without naval escort to try to not draw attention. Everybody wears civilian clothing. He says, in my opinion, we coped satisfactorily with the tasks we set ourselves in the first stage. The United States did not know that we had transported missiles to Cuba, but later it became hard to conceal the facts. U.S. intelligence begins to catch on because there are abnormal events and quantities of loading and unloading cargoes. Once the missiles were in place, there was no longer any special difficulty in finding out what it was. When we received aerial photographs published to the American press, we realized now that it was plain for all to see that surface-to-surface missiles had been installed. That is, missiles could now strike at the United States from Cuba. The Americans correctly interpreted the meaning. Those accursed palm trees hadn't concealed anything, and our scouts had shamefully disgraced themselves. So there's a lot of humility here and like self-awareness of like, boy, we really botched that part. I think it's interesting to read this from his perspective. I don't know if y'all are finding that. Those of you who lived through this, I know this was a really scary time. And so I don't mean to convey at all a dismissing of the fear of these days. I know this was a terribly frightful season of American history and a really important time when we got to see cards on the table, what everyone actually wanted out of the Cold War. And I think to both of these men's credit, to Khrushchev and to Kennedy, they navigated extremely difficult waters to the saving of millions of people. So let's keep reading. When the Americans guessed our intentions and found out we were installing missiles in Cuba, an unbelievable uproar broke out in the U.S. press. The heat of debate was very intense. It must be kept in mind that we were very vulnerable in Cuba even then. Our Navy was not what it is today. We had hardly any nuclear-powered submarines, and in general, the distance of 7,000 miles is one that requires serious consideration. It was hard for our submarines to come in close to Cuba. There were a lot of small islands and underwater reefs, making it difficult for submarines to pass through. It's not such a simple matter to engage in a battle against the United States along the shores of Cuba. And to tell the truth, we never had that intention. The reason we installed missiles with nuclear warheads, as I have said, was not to attack the United States, but exclusively to defend Cuba. We wanted the U.S. not to attack Cuba, and that was all. The Americans warned us unofficially through channels we had with President Kennedy and those acting in his behalf that they knew we were setting up missiles in Cuba. Naturally, we denied everything. Some might say this was perfidy on our part. Unfortunately, this type of diplomacy persists in our times, and we didn't invent anything new in this respect. We merely made use of the same methods our opponents used. After all, they didn't warn us that they were going to place missiles in Turkey or that they had missiles already in Italy and other NATO countries. They were spying us and sending their spy planes over our territory, but they constantly denied it. So he's saying, yeah, our denial was a lie, but everybody lies about these things. They all spy on each other and deny that they've done it. A great duel began to be waged. They have talks through their secretaries, Gromyko and Secretary of State Rusk, but they continued to transport and set up their weapons. They continued to do what they were doing. He says, the most acute phase of the crisis lasted 6 to 7 days. In order to reduce the tension somewhat, I made the following proposal to the members of Soviet leadership. Let's go to the Bolshoi Theater, comrades. The world situation today is full of tension, and yet we are going to show up at the theater. Our people and the foreigners will see this, and that will have a calming effect. If Khrushchev and the other leaders are going to the theater at a time like this, then it must be possible to sleep peacefully. We didn't want a war, and we didn't want to suffer casualties ourselves. We didn't want to cause loss and injury to America. But what if a war started? That's why, at one particularly worrisome time, I spent the whole night in the Kremlin. He's talking about Friday night, October 26th. A continual exchange of letters was going on between President Kennedy and us, and I spent the night at the offices of the USSR Council of Ministers, expecting that at any moment alarming news might be transmitted, to which it would be necessary to react immediately. The troops were warned. American planes are constantly flying over Cuba, and it says it's driving Castro out of his mind. He opens fire, and the military brings down an American U-2 spy plane. Khrushchev confesses this. He says, "We were somewhat concerned that President Kennedy might not be able to absorb this blow of having had a U-2 spy plane shot down. At that point, we gave instructions to our commander not to take orders from anyone but us. He wanted war not to go break out by accident." The culminating moment arrived when our Soviet ambassador to the United States reported to us that the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, had come to see him on an unofficial visit. Dobrynin described his outward appearance as follows. Robert Kennedy looked very tired. His eyes were very red. It was obvious that he hadn't slept all night, and he stated so himself later on. He and the president had been sitting in the White House racking their brains over the problem. And he added, "The tension in our country is very severe. The danger of a war is very great. Please convey it to your government and to Khrushchev personally that he should take this into account. The president is preparing a message to be sent through confidential channels and earnestly requests that Khrushchev accept his proposals." Robert Kennedy also added that the president didn't know how to get out of this situation, that the military men were putting heavy pressure on him, insisting that he take military action against Cuba. He said, "You should take into account the particular features of our governmental system. It's hard for the president, even if he doesn't want a war and doesn't wish for war. Against his will, something irreversible might happen. That's why the president is asking that you help solve the problem." Then Robert Kennedy left his phone number with the ambassador and said, "You can call day or night." In a state of great nervous tension, he kept repeatedly appealing for prudence and good sense, asking us to help the president get out of this situation. By that time, the American military has moved. Navy is out in the open ocean. Land forces are on U.S. coastal areas near Cuba. Basically, all the military preparations for an invasion had been put into place. Khrushchev says, of course, missile supremacy was on the side of the United States, but he understood that supremacy is a relative thing. The missiles that we had made operational could still do their job. They could wipe New York off the face of the earth, along with Washington and other industrial cities and administrative centers. Of course, the United States could also do great damage to the Soviet Union. If a war started, it would not be like World War I or World War II, in which many Americans never heard gunfire. They didn't know what it was to have bombs and artillery shells exploding. They had fought on foreign territory. But in this war, if it broke out, they would be bringing the fire down on themselves. Thermonuclear bombs. Actually, what we were trying to achieve was to have America shake itself out of its sleep, and for its leadership to get a feeling of what war actually is, to realize it was standing on the threshold of war, and that therefore it should not go over the brink, that a military confrontation should be avoided. We studied the document sent to us by the president and replied to it. I don't have those materials right at hand, and I am describing everything exclusively from memory. I experienced this with great intensity and remember everything well, because from beginning to end, I was responsible, first of all, for this action. I had been its initiator, and all the correspondence we had with the president was formulated by me. It's a consolation to me now that on the whole, we acted correctly and accomplished a great revolutionary deed. The United States made a commitment not to invade Cuba itself and not to allow its allies to invade, and thus far it has fulfilled that commitment. That's how we'll let it wrap for the Cuban Missile Crisis. The next thing that we get to, of course, is the assassination. And the only thing that Khrushchev says about who he believes was responsible was this. In 1968, I read an article in our Soviet magazine in which a foreign author was reminiscing about the Caribbean crisis. This article also described the assassination of President Kennedy. As I recall, the article was entitled 6 Seconds. It asked the direct question, who killed the president? Who were these people? The article points to the fact that in the course of the resolution of the Caribbean crisis, the U.S. president had to give assurances that he would not allow an invasion of Cuba by U.S. forces or by their allies. The author writes that embittered the Cuban counter-revolutionaries, and as a result, they became participants in the plot to kill Kennedy. Later, he says, when Kennedy was assassinated, I was worried about how our relations would develop after that. I had confidence in Kennedy and saw that he was not inclined towards military confrontation, but how would the new president, Lyndon Johnson, behave? Once he had assumed his duties in the White House, he informed us through the existing channels that all the commitments made by Kennedy publicly and all the assurances Kennedy had given through confidential channels would be honored. But he closes this whole section with his description of John Kennedy. And this is really what the whole reading centers on, is how did he assess John Kennedy as his adversary? Let me say something more about John Kennedy. I wanted to show what Kennedy was like in specific dealings. When he was assassinated, I sincerely regretted it. I immediately went to the American Embassy and expressed my condolences. Kennedy and I were different kinds of people. I was a former mine worker, a machinist, an industrial worker who, by the will of the party, became prime minister, whereas he was a millionaire and the son of a millionaire. We represented classes that were in irreconcilable opposition to each other. The aim he pursued was to strengthen capitalism. The aim I pursued was to destroy capitalism and build a new social system based on the ideas developed by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. The views Kennedy held were, of course, different. Despite the fact that we stood at opposite poles, when things came down to a question of war or peace, we were able to arrive at a common understanding and prevent military confrontations. I give him the credit that is due to him as the counterpart who sat opposite us at the negotiating table. I hold his memory in respect and highly value what he did in life. And that is true even though in a great many things we not only differed but held opposing positions, as for example at Vienna. In spite of everything, on the fundamental questions, the questions of war and peace, we did find a common language. We also made an agreement with Kennedy to establish direct telephone communication so that there would be a hotline in the event that an emergency situation arose and personal talks between the president and the head of the Soviet government were necessary. People may ask, why should we rejoice over that? No, there is nothing to rejoice about, but this detail did give some assurance that at a critical moment, there could be talks, direct talks, that wouldn't have to go through the diplomatic labyrinth. The main thing is that our resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis gave me grounds for having confidence in this man. He was seeking ways of establishing communications, setting up technical devices that would help us avoid a conflict. To keep a war from breaking out, we also need intelligent counterparts on the other side. I consider that John Kennedy, as a representative of the capitalist world, was just such a counterpart. With that, I will end my account of the Caribbean crisis. It was a very interesting and highly instructive series of events. It seemed as though the two most powerful countries in the world were about to butt heads. It seemed as though a military denouement was unavoidable. We actually had our strategic missiles ready to be launched, while the United States had surrounded the island of Cuba with naval vessels and had concentrated its infantry and air force. But we showed that if we were guided by rational aims and the desire not to allow a war to happen, the disputed questions could be resolved by compromise, and it was possible to find such a compromise. Reason prevailed. That's why, in my memory, the very best recollections remain about the late U.S. president. He showed soberness of mind. He didn't allow himself to be frightened, nor did he allow himself to become intoxicated with the military might of the United States. It's interesting to consider that he's kind of downplaying this importance of communication, but I'm just struck by the idea that in any relationship, the key point at which things break down, in relationship matters, there's this interesting researcher named, I think, John Gottman, who basically noted that a couple that's still at least fighting with one another is still putting their skin in the game. But the minute that talking stops, the minute there's apathy, and he noted it with like certain physical characteristics of like even like turning away, or like there just being like a disengagement, that actually is the most dangerous thing for a relationship, because the critical thing is staying in communication. And so I'm just struck by that comparison here, that actually them maintaining communications during those critical moments and then afterward establishing this hotline is actually significant. It's very significant, and he doesn't need to downplay it for us. For me, that's a very critical point. He closes it this way: to keep a war from breaking out, we also need intelligent counterparts on the other side. I consider that John Kennedy, as the representative of the capitalist world, was just such a counterpart. With that, I will end my account of the Caribbean crisis. It was a very interesting and highly instructive series of events. It seemed as though the two most powerful countries in the world were about to butt heads. It seemed as though a military denouement was unavoidable. We actually had our strategic missiles ready to be launched, while the United States had surrounded the island of Cuba with naval vessels and had concentrated its infantry and air force. But we showed that if we were guided by rational aims and the desire not to allow a war to happen, the disputed questions could be resolved by compromise, and it was possible to find such a compromise. Reason prevailed. That's why, in my memory, the very best recollections remain about the late U.S. president. He showed soberness of mind. He didn't allow himself to be frightened, nor did he allow himself to become intoxicated with the military might of the United States. He didn't decide to go for broke. It doesn't take great intelligence, as I have said, to start a war. But he displayed civic courage, the courage of a statesman. He was not afraid of being condemned from the right, and peace won out. For my part, I really enjoyed this reading of Memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev. I hope you did too. It's interesting to read from the perspective of the opponent, but also I really enjoyed. There's so much more in this book. Honestly, I found it very fascinating to read through his perspective on the different negotiations about Germany, West Berlin, disarmament, and the question of Cuba. Really fascinating to get in the head of this senior statesman in the USSR, but particularly his view of Kennedy and the kind of statesman, the kind of sober-minded thinker, and even the way that I know Kennedy was criticized for using his brother as his attorney general, but we can see in that moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis how the significance of Kennedy having someone who would stay up all night with him, his very own brother, to whom he could disclose all of his thoughts, all of his fears, all of his concerns, and then be able to communicate wholeheartedly to that brother and entrust a message that would get to the Soviet premier so that by some means they might together feel their way through the narrow straits of what was almost certainly nuclear war, and instead come through on the other side with both countries having not deployed nuclear weapons, not gone into hot war, and instead made it through, and at the end developing a line of communication. To me, that's fascinating, and it gives us an important look at the person of John Kennedy, why he was significant, why it's not overblown to talk about him as a great statesman, as a great president. And I know some of you who have read the books like Ask Not and The Kennedy Men with me will also say, well, some of you have made comments like this. Because of his moral failures, I can't see him as a great man. And my point is we can do both. We can acknowledge that reportedly, an intern named Mimi Alford was spending her times with John Kennedy in the middle of this crisis. And we can say that's deplorable. A man shouldn't use power that way with a young lady. He also should not commit adultery against his wife. We can acknowledge all those things as true. And we can also say this is skilled statesmanship. This is admirable leadership that for the benefit of the whole world, for the saving of the lives of millions of people who surely would have had the loss of life, not just through the over time effects of nuclear weapons having been deployed, like cancers and radioactive effects, but also the lives that would have been lost in a hot war, in Russian troops, American troops, Cuban troops, and surely other countries that would have been pulled into what would have probably been called World War III. And instead, these two leaders navigated that and got us through. So I feel very grateful to have read this. I hope you did too. I hope you guys stay with me now. I do want to say that while this gives us context for Kennedy as president, and it does give us who Khrushchev is giving the nod to who he thinks is responsible. He's saying, at least in this memoir, that there is truth to the idea that the Cubans got involved in the plot on Kennedy's life. He doesn't say outright that that's what he believes. He does say that there's truth to that statement. So that's his nod. Next time, we are going to get directly back into the storyline of the assassination through this book, Robert Groden's book, The Search for Lee Harvey Oswald. And we are going to look specifically at Oswald's time in Russia. So last time we looked at Oswald, we looked at his time in Japan, and he had a short blip between Japan and Russia where he came back, visited his mom, and then we're going to meet him in the travel to Russia and his time in Russia, where he'll meet Marina. So come back for that next time. I look forward to going through that with you. We learned so much about Lee in our last reading, and I'm looking forward to more from this fabulous book. So I'll see you next time. I hope you have a great day. Bye.